right, I think I have everything set up, so we'll give the projector a moment to warm up. But hi, welcome to PSY 104E, Basic Psychological Processes, assuming that we're all in the right place. I don't know about you guys, but today is my first day on campus, so I did a little bit of wandering around to figure out where I was supposed to be. Just because there's no screen or anything here, I am going to keep my mask on, but if you guys find it hard to understand me, just let me know, and maybe I can try and pivot or something so that I'm breathing that way. Just keep me posted. All right. So I wanted to thank everyone for coming in today, for following the mask mandate. What I want to start off by saying is if you guys aren't comfortable being here, you are more than welcome to go home. I'm going to be recording all of my lectures so that I post those online. So that's what this setup here is. I've done online learning for almost 2 years now, so it's pretty much the same setup whether I'm here or there. So if you find that more comfortable, then don't worry about it. The only time you have to be in class is for our exams. So the 2 midterms and the final exam, which I'll get into as we get to that part of the lecture. All right, so I always like to start off by introducing myself. I didn't quite understand this when I was an undergrad, which was a little while ago now, I guess, but I've had it explained to me as I'm trying to teach you guys to think critically, to sort of evaluate where information is coming from and what you're going to do with it. So this is me giving you the information to critically evaluate me, telling you information. So for an academic background, I'm Dr. Kimberly Campbell. You can call me Dr. Campbell. You can call me Kimberly. Either is perfectly acceptable. For my credentials, I have a Bachelor of Science from Dalhousie University. Kind of interestingly, I started off in physics, switched over to biology, and got my degree in bio. Worked in a lab for a while, did a bunch of genetics, PCR type stuff, lots of cloning. Really boring if you know what that is, but it sounds cool. And then I pivoted completely and started at the U of A doing psychology. So I did a Master's of Science and a Doctor of Philosophy there in comparative cognition. So you might find that some of my perspectives lean a little bit closer to behaviorism or cognitive behaviorism as we get into those fields, but I am going to touch on a bunch of different perspectives. I have recently started adding a little bit about me as a person as well, so that I'm not just some faceless academic with some degrees, I'm also a human being. So I'm an avid bird lover. I like chocolate, I do photography in my free time. I play a lot of Pokemon and have since I was very young, and I collect hobbies, so whenever I have some downtime, I try out new things. And I include my birds here, my research assistants. If ever I record something at home, say an announcement or something like that, these guys tend to make an appearance in the background, which is fun. Oh, I did include this, perfect. I want to do a little bit more detail about my research background. So that undergrad research I alluded to, so I did sequencing DNA, trying to identify single-celled organisms in soil samples, which is kind of what I meant by it sounds nice on the surface, but it's really dull. Basically, we collected dirt and extracted DNA from it to see what was in it. I then moved on and went in that other direction and studied communication in black-capped chickadees. So I've taken psychology and it's a little bit of a bio twist, which is nice. And of course, just another close-up, because cute birds, why not? So this is Link and Sheik. Link is the green one, Sheik is the yellow one, and if you're a fan of Legend of Zelda, you might get the reference. All right, so more relevant stuff, my teaching philosophy. You might have noticed that my slides are really boring, and that's intentional. Early on in my teaching career, I had a couple of students who had trouble seeing slides, especially the figures that come out of textbooks, because those are awful. So my slides are very plain, black and white. They're meant to be high contrast and easy to see. So yeah, they're a little bit boring, but on the plus side, it gives you space to write notes. and it makes it sort of simple to look at. I'm always looking for ways to improve my courses, so if something occurs to you that, hey, it would be really cool if you added this, or I'd like to see that, let me know. I'm always open to feedback. And for you guys, try and make use of the resources that are available. So I like to include videos and extra links. You'll find that up on Moodle, which we'll come to in a minute. Just not so much because they're necessary, but because I like to give multiple perspectives on topics and things like that. And if you're struggling, don't be afraid to ask for help. So if you have a question, you can send me an email. We can set up a Zoom meeting if you want to chat face-to-face. Any of those things, those are available to you. So don't ever feel sort of timid to reach out to me. All right, so now I do a little bit of a detour, and I do a brief note about how talking to people in academia works. And again, I do this because when I was an undergrad, nobody told me this stuff. So I was left confused and kind of scared trying to talk to people. So I include just a little bit of for your information. This isn't testable, it's just helpful. So when you're sending emails or meeting with somebody, there's always that, well, what do I call you? Do I call you doctor or professor or instructor or what? And that's going to depend on the person, which is really complicated. But doctor is a pretty fair term to address anybody if they have a PhD or an MD. I have experience with the PhD side of things, which is why I introduce myself as Dr. Campbell. A professor would be somebody who's usually a doctor, but who also has the job title of professor. So for me, I'm not hired as a professor, I'm a lecturer, which means that you can call me doctor, but not professor. And then instructor is someone who isn't a professor, but is teaching a course, so I would fall under that category too. And for those who like visuals, I did a Venn diagram that shows where I sit. It's too nice here. There. So that's me there. So I could be an instructor or a doctor, but I am not a professor. And then if that's not confusing enough, I included an example of how you could look this sort of stuff up. I use my supervisor from my graduate studies just because he's easy to find. So I would go to whatever school you're at or whoever you're looking for, wherever they're at, search for them in their find a person function, because that seems to be pretty ubiquitous. And for here, we can see that, oh, Christopher Sturdy, he has a PhD, so we could call him Dr. Sturdy. His official job title is also a professor of science, so we could call him Professor Sturdy, and both would be acceptable. So that's sort of how I break it down. That's like your first contact. Once you've contacted somebody, then you can see how they respond to you, and that's how they are preferring to be addressed. So if you've sent me an email, you might notice that I always respond with just my first name, and that's me saying, I don't mind if you use that instead of a title. So you can watch for that in other people that you interact with. If they reply with their first name, that's usually them saying, use my first name. But if they reply with their full title, they probably want you to stick to a title. So just a little aside and hopefully useful information at some point. All right, so part 3, when we actually get into the course itself. I find most of our time on the first day is just getting into how the course is going to work. Since this might be your first course, I'm going to do a little bit more detail than otherwise. So if you've already taken a course, some of this might be kind of boring. You can just zone out for a few minutes. So the most important source is Moodle. Moodle is the main hub for getting resources for this course. So that's where we're going to have lots of general information. So you can find our syllabus up on our Moodle site. You can find announcements for this class, as well as some frequently asked questions. I like to update sort of if I have a bunch of emails from students about particular questions, then I'll post that so everybody can see it. Because usually if more than one person asks, it means I wasn't clear or it's something that people want more info on. It's also where you're going to get resources for our course assessments. So if I give you instructions on how the midterms are going to be handled, that's going to be up on Moodle. And you're also going to be able to access our lecture recordings and slides. So the recording that I'm doing, I'm going to post there after class. And the slides, I try and post those in advance of the class. So you might have noticed, if you have been to our Moodle page, that you could access our Day 1 slides, which is what I'm working off of now, as well as our Chapter 1 slides, which are what we'll transition to if we still have some time. All right, so let's see how this handles swapping over. So as an example, this is what Moodle looks like. Yours might be a smidge different just because this is the instructor's view. I don't know how much that changes because I don't get a student view, but it should be fairly similar. You have a calendar here where you can add important dates and deadlines if you so desire. Some important links, so things like, oh look, my email address. So when you email me, if you could, please include the course code in that subject line. I am teaching multiple classes, and it gets really easy to mix up which class you're in. So if I want to give you the right information, I need to know what class you're from. So this is, like I said, our course syllabus. I'm actually going to pull that up because it's going to be important in a moment. So I'll minimize that for now. Announcements, we don't have any announcements quite yet. But if something ever happens or changes, that's where I'll contact everyone in the course. I've also included sort of drop-down menus here, so you can open and close whatever you find useful. This, what to expect in the course, is a really good place to start, just giving you most of the important stuff that I've got over, or that I will go over today. So a little bit about attendance, reading the textbook, chapter quizzes, class slides, that sort of stuff. We're going to cover all of that in the syllabus. I also, let's close that. I also have our textbook information, so if you need links to get to the textbook or to some of the extra resources that come from the publisher, those are there as well. We don't have any chapter quizzes posted quite yet because I don't think we're going to cover much of Chapter 1 yet today. I should have those starting to show up this afternoon/tomorrow, and I'll talk about those more. And then for our slides, if you hadn't figured it out, this is week 1, which we are now in, and those are the slides there. And I've posted them in PDF and PowerPoint, just so hopefully everybody can access them. If you need a different format, just let me know. All right. Let's see. We're just going to skim through the syllabus. It would be a good idea if you haven't read through a syllabus before, if you went through it and sort of read it in detail. They're all going to be fairly similar because we all follow the same template, so it's pretty redundant if you've read one before. So it just shows what the course is about, prerequisites, me and my information, the lecture information, the textbook again. This chart here is going to be one of the most important charts for this class, and that's because it gives us all the important dates and topics and things that you need to prepare for. So it's going to show us when our midterms are. So our first midterm is September 27th. I've also included holidays, so Thanksgiving. We have midterm number 2 on November 1st. We also lose a week due to reading week, so that's in there as well. And so it just sort of gives you an idea of what we're covering and when those tests are coming up. So a good idea when you start in a course is to add those into a calendar, just so that you can find them and keep track of them. All right, so I've already mentioned that we're going to have midterms and a final exam. So the midterms are September 27th and November 3rd. They're going to be held in this classroom. So like I said, this is the only time you have to be in this room is for the assessments. Our final exam date is to be determined, but I think they've posted a tentative date. So if you go into, I can't remember what the system is called, but if you look at your class schedule, it should list a tentative exam date. So that's going to be early December. And that will be written in this classroom as well. And the way that I do midterms is I do mostly multiple choice questions, but I also do a couple of short written answer questions. And the way that I've designed this is they're actually going to be an open book test. So you can bring your notes with you, you can flip through, you can make yourself a cheat sheet, whatever you think is going to help. I don't like to test your ability to memorize. I really like to test if you understand a concept and if you can make use of that information. So I wouldn't say which researcher pioneered this field. I might say this person was involved in this field. What does that mean? Or how would we interpret that field and what they did? Or how would they think about a particular situation? So a little bit more application and a little bit less memorization. So that's what we're aiming for. And so that's going to be the same for the midterms and the final exam. Those are all going to be open book. And the 2 midterms are not cumulative, which means that our first midterm is going to cover the first 3 chapters. The second midterm covers just the next 3 chapters, so there's no overlap in content there. But at the end, we are going to have a cumulative final, which means I will ask you a couple of questions from the early chapters, but we're going to focus mainly on the later chapters. So I usually find it's about a 70-30 split, so 70% new, 30% old, and I like to find questions that overlap. So if I can ask you a question from, say, chapter 8 that relates back to chapter 2, that's a good question in my book. All right, I'm also going to have a written assignment. So I intentionally don't give a ton of information about the written assignment early on because you guys have enough on your plates right off the bat. So what I do is I introduce our written assignment after the first midterm. So at the beginning of October, I'll have at the beginning of a lecture, we'll sit down and we'll talk about the written assignment. Basically, I'm going to get you to read a scientific article and write a very short, typically a 2-page double-spaced summary of what that article means. So it tends to be very short. I'm just looking at you to think critically. And it's something that if you understand the topic, if you pick an article that you enjoy and follow, you can have it done in like an hour or 2. So again, I'm not trying to overwhelm you with stuff, just so you don't have to panic about that yet. All right. Our last piece of assessment is going to be our chapter quizzes, which I kind of hinted at earlier. Those are going to pop up on Moodle as time goes on. I'm going to try and release them concurrently with what we're covering in class. So like I said, we might start chapter 1 today, which means I'm going to try and post our chapter 1 quizzes today, tomorrow. If I have stuff earlier, I'll always post it earlier, but I'm trying to make changes and update my content to make it better, so sometimes it takes me a little while. But the way that these chapter quizzes are going to work is they're basically keeping you on topic and making sure that you understand what's going on in the class. So they're trying to get you to read through and follow the lectures or read the chapters at about the pace that we're working on, but I'm not having hard deadlines on them. So our first 3 chapters, chapters 1, 2, and 3, are going to be covered all through September, but they're not due until our midterm date. So you have all the way up until September 27th to submit those quizzes. You can submit them early if you want, but I'm going to set them up so that you can log in, you can look at the questions, you can log out, you can log back in again. So they're going to be no time limit and no sort of number of login limits. So again, open book, something that you can do while you're reading, something that you can collaborate with others if you'd like. They're just meant to be sort of a litmus test for me of if you're staying on topic and if stuff's making sense for you. So those chapter quizzes will be a little bit more on the memorization side of things. So a little bit of memorization, a little bit of understanding, and a smidge of application, whereas our sort of sit-down midterms are going to be much heavier on that application side of things. We'll lose the memorization for the big tests. But yeah, so those are just going to be, are you understanding the topics? Are you staying up with stuff? And I'm going to pull from a pool of questions, so everybody's test will be just a little bit different. But as I said, I don't mind if you collaborate on those. All right, let's see if I have anything else in here. Oh yeah, with emails, this is probably a good thing to cover. I already mentioned including the course code in the subject line, just so that I know where you're emailing from. If at all possible, try and send me an email sort of well in advance of when you need a response. Sometimes it can take a little while, especially with multiple courses. I'll do my best, but I usually give sort of a 24-hour window that I'll try and get back to you within. So I try not to do too many emails evenings or weekends, but during the week, within 24 hours for sure. And if you can try and give me sort of an understanding of what you do understand about a topic. So instead of just emailing me and saying, hey, I don't understand what behaviorism is, maybe you could say, okay, we talked about behaviorism, this is what I get, but I'm not sure how to apply it, or I'm not sure how it applies in this situation or how we can use it. If you can tell me sort of where you specifically have that issue, it makes it a lot easier for me to give you an answer that actually helps. So try and give me as much understanding of where you're at before you contact me. All right. And so for missed work, especially nowadays, I try and get you to just give me as much warning as you can. So if you can't come to a midterm, or if you can't submit an assignment or something, if you can let me know in advance, we can usually come to some sort of arrangement. I'll try and be accommodating, just give me as much warning as you can. The official thing is if you have to miss an exam, or, sorry, for this is midterms, you have 24 hours to get in touch with me to let me know what was going on. Of course, if it's some extenuating circumstance and you can't get in touch with me until later, that's fine. Just try and get in touch as soon as possible. I think with final examinations, those are a little bit different. So with, say, if you miss a midterm, I wouldn't have a make-up midterm. We would just shift the weight of the midterm to the final exam. But if you miss a final exam, then we have to arrange an alternate time to write an exam. But again, all of this info is here in our syllabus. And I think that's everything I wanted to touch on. As I said, if you haven't read through a syllabus before, I'd say read this all the way through. There's lots of useful links and information, especially about the department, so that's a good place to start. All right, before I get into actual content, does anyone have questions or anything they want more info on? No? Okay. All right. So we are going to swap over to chapter 1. So we have sort of this one chapter to cover this week. My intent is to let you guys go just a little bit early because sometimes the hallways get a little bit crowded. So I'm not going to keep you right to the buzzer every single time. I also tend to lose track of time, so if it's ever getting close, you can just sort of point at the clock and let me know. Oh, yeah?
Do you recommend the textbook for this class?
Do I recommend the textbook for this class? It depends. I find some students do really well with the textbook. Reading a textbook really helps them. Some people are good at reading a textbook before they come to class, and that helps them understand concepts. Some people use the textbook for after class when they look up stuff that they haven't quite understood. But some people just don't use textbooks. And you should be able to get by with lecture notes. Just keep in mind that the test questions are going to be based on the textbook. The way that I describe it is I pick my test questions and I pick my lecture notes. So I choose what I think is most important from the text to talk about and to test about. So there's a lot of overlap between lecture and test question, but I can't say that it's going to be mutually exclusive because there might be a couple of things that aren't quite covered in detail in lecture that might pop up in a question. But if that's ambiguous enough, does that kind of answer the question? Yeah. Just give it a little bit of time. If you see how I lecture, and then maybe look at the first chapter quizzes, see if you're comfortable just with the lecture topics and how I teach. But if my teaching style doesn't quite line up with how you learn, then maybe pick up the text. Cool. All right. Okay, so our first question, I guess, is what is psychology? When you come to an intro psych class, you haven't necessarily taken psychology before. So a lot of people will associate psychology with the study and treatment of psychological disorders. So you might think of a Freudian therapist sitting in a red chair with a person on a couch in front of them, asking them to relive their deepest, darkest secrets. But in reality, psychology is so much more than that. And even just from me talking already today, you might have realized that stuff might count as psychology that you didn't think of before. So for example, I study behavior in birds, and I'm technically a psychologist. And that doesn't quite line up with that Freudian couch. So there's a lot more to it than that. And psychology is kind of an interesting beast, because psychology as a field is fairly recent. It's only, I think, like 150 years old. We'll get the specific dates later on. But it has a long history. So a lot of the ideas that are very central to psychology have been around for years. And by years, I mean centuries. So we're going to look at stuff all the way back to 900 AD. And those still count as ideas core and central to psychology, even though psychology didn't exist until the 1980s. So if we're going to answer this, what is psychology? Let's look at the roots of the word. So we have psyche for the soul. This is Greek. And logos meaning to study. So we're trying to study the soul. Now, different textbooks have different definitions of psychology. The two that I've seen most often are the scientific study of behavior and the mind, or the scientific study of conscious experience. Now, I tend to prefer the first of these, and the reason is that second definition, talking about conscious experience, it kind of excludes anything unconscious. And as we'll find, especially as we get into things like psychoanalysis, we talk quite a lot about the unconscious. So even though our textbook happens to use that scientific study of conscious experience, I'd much rather talk about psychology as the scientific study of behavior and the mind. So the first thing we need to consider here is it's scientific. So our knowledge is going to be discovered through some kind of empirical observation. So we're going to critically evaluate information. We're going to observe our environment. We're going to collect data. So it is a scientific study. And if we talk about behavior, behavior is that observable action, something usually external that we can measure and document. So that is something that would be scientifically studied. But we also include that ending bit of studying the mind. And the contents of our mind are going to include conscious experience as well as the other stuff that makes me dislike that second definition. So it includes stuff like sensations, perceptions, thoughts, and emotions, and things that we aren't necessarily aware of. So we put it all together and we can say that psychology is our study of behavior and the mind. And so we're going to talk just a little bit about the scientific approach here, but we're going to get into it in much more detail in the second chapter, where we start talking about methodology and sort of how we do science. But for the basics to get started, we've already said a systematic gathering as well as evaluation of empirical evidence. So we're going to collect information by observing our environment. We're going to bring in that information, and then we're going to evaluate it somehow. So from a practical point of view, gathering evidence is watching things, recording things. Maybe we have machines that store things for us. That's the gathering part. The evaluation is where we get into maybe statistics. We can start looking at, okay, do we have differences depending on conditions? And again, we'll do more of that in the next chapter. So when we talk about it being systemic, we're talking about it being performed according to a particular set of rules. So you're not just going to randomly take pictures of frogs on the sidewalk and call that science. Maybe you're going to take pictures of every frog you walk by along a particular stretch every Tuesday for a year. That would follow a set of rules, and it has sort of a little bit of reproducibility theoretically, as long as frog patterns don't change and maybe there's no construction on the street or something like that. And then for empirical, when we talk about something being empirical, the key point here is that it's capable of being verified or disproven by observation or experiment. So again, more in the next chapter, but one of the key points of trying to empirically evaluate something is that there should be some kind of evidence that might appear that would make you say the thing we thought was happening is definitely not happening. We'll talk a little bit more about it. We don't necessarily prove that something is happening. We can get more evidence and be more confident that something is happening a particular way, but we can only prove a negative. We can disprove our idea. We can say that it's not doing that thing, but we can't ever be 100% positive that we've got the right answer. So we're constantly gathering evidence and becoming more confident, but we're never going to say that we've proven something. All right. Still doing good on time. So when we start talking about gathering and collecting information and evaluating that evidence that we've collected, that's when we're starting to do science. And you're doing research by following those processes. And we can actually break down the types of research into two broad categories. I will briefly mention a third that kind of bridges the gap between these at the end. So there are two categories with an overlap in the middle. So our two broad categories are basic and applied research. So basic research is research seeking knowledge for the sake of knowledge. I want to understand black-capped chickadees because I don't know anything about them. So I'd like to research them and figure out what they do. An applied research question would be doing that research to try and answer a specific question or to solve a specific problem. So maybe I'm going to study black-capped chickadees because they're endangered in this area and I need to know why they're endangered. So I'm going to do research to stop whatever's harming them. So when I ask questions on midterms, and I'll give you an example and say, Bobby wants to study X because he thinks it's cool. I'm saying, okay, you should identify that there's knowledge for the sake of knowledge, so that would be basic research. Whereas if I say, okay, well maybe Billy wants to research Y because he needs to solve a particular question related to Y, then I'm leaning you towards applied research. So there's almost always a question that relates to those concepts, just as a hint. And for some kind of cool examples, because I don't just love birds, I also love cephalopods. If we were looking at basic research, there's a lot of places that study cephalopods. So the Queensland Brain Institute does a lot of really cool stuff looking at how these guys work. So they want to figure out, how do these cephalopods see the world? How do they communicate? Like, what is happening? They don't have a particular problem they're trying to solve. They just want to know what they're doing. I attended a conference not too long ago where they were talking about nautili, which fall under that category of cephalopods. And they're the ones that sort of look like squids at the front but have snail shells on the back. And their entire presentation was, we think we figured out what they eat. And they've been studying them for like a year and a half, and they're like, I think we've got it. We know what of the things in their tank that they're eating now. Now we can move forward. So that's basic research. For applied research, there's a really cool project in the vein of cephalopods called the Octopus Project, and they're specifically studying how octopus tentacles work in order to design a robot that can work underwater in all dimensions. And so they're trying to understand how those legs work, specifically to solve a particular problem. So that would be applied research. And there's some links there if you ever want to go check those out. And if I include links like this, it's usually just for interest's sake. I will mention if it's something that's super important, but I mostly just include stuff because I think it's cool. And then for the promised third sort of transitional in between the two type of research, it's actually called translational research, which makes logical sense. And this is when you take the things that you learn from your basic research and try and apply it to a problem. So you maybe learn something with no intention of solving a problem, but then you realize that it might be really useful. So maybe my I want to study chickadees because they're cool led to me figuring out that there was a cat loose in an area and it was killing all the chickadees. I could then use what I found from my basic curiosity about chickadees and find a way to maybe keep the cat from getting into the tree they like. So I can apply something that it was acquired from basic. And just for those of you who are more visual learners, we have at the top here, so we have our basic research, which is where we're gathering information for the sake of gathering information. And then once we know enough about a topic, we might use what we've learned to go into our applied research. I've learned that chickadees call in a particular way. Let's look at how traffic noise affects that and how we can change it. Or maybe we're going to take our basic research and we're going to have it come down to applied practice. So we're going to use things that we've learned in the lab in a practical way. So maybe I studied sound propagation in the lab and I was like, hey, that could help in the classroom. I know that certain frequencies transmit very well in particular spaces, so maybe I'll modulate my voice to that particular frequency or something like that. And that information can come from applied research as well. So if you've done applied research to solve a problem, that can also be applied in the real world. And then you can sometimes consider clinical research and practice a little bit separate. And that's because of the way that it's set up. So it's on the clinical side of things, it's done by clinical psychologists, which I am definitely not. But it's mostly dealing with humans, and it's going to be a lot more on the side of learning about and treating different disorders. So that's why that one is on its own. All right. Yeah, I'm going to start just a little bit about early history. I'm trying to decide the best place to cut off for today. But we'll do just a smidge of early history. And as I mentioned earlier on, with psychology, there's not a whole lot of history of psychology as a field. And that's because psychology came around in pretty much the 1870s. So not too long ago. Now is a great time to point out, I don't really care all that much about dates. I include them because some people find them helpful to put things in order. But I'm a little bit number dyslexic, so I tend to say numbers wrong, and it just leads to me not caring about them. So I include the dates, but I would never ask you a question that pivots entirely around a date. So I wouldn't say who founded a field in this year. Instead, I would say in this year, this particular field was founded. Who did it? Maybe, if it was a quiz question. I don't like testing names either, for about the same reason. But just as a little bit of a heads up for the types of information that's relevant versus not. I don't love testing about names or dates in isolation. That's where that whole memorization versus applied questions comes in. You can memorize a date or a name, But in the real world, you'd be able to look that stuff up. I'd much rather you understand how a particular field interprets information or how they view the world, as opposed to who discovered it or founded it and when. All right, well, that was a little bit of a tangent there, but our early history, as I said, goes back many, many centuries. So we can go as far back as philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, who were asking questions about the mind and philosophizing. We might also look at physiologists, so people who detailed the anatomy of the brain. And this is one of those instances where I actually found a little bit less focused on Europe and North America, but they talk about one of the first physiologists studying the brain and specifically trying to explain psychological disorders as illnesses rather than as demonic possession or something else. So Ali ibn al-Abanas al-Mujuzi, they were a Persian physicist back in 1900 AD who was actually starting to look at what we would consider psychological disorders nowadays, all the way back then, way before psychology was even a thing. And so I thought that was a really interesting tidbit to include. So one of the first things that we're going to talk about when it comes to sort of perspectives and considerations in psychology is a little bit of a problem in what we're looking at. We've talked about psychology as study of behavior and the mind, specifically scientific study. But how do you study the mind if we've said that the mind is that internal stuff, the things that we can't necessarily observe? How can you actually study it? And we have two very different perspectives on what this means. So if we're going to try and study psychology, if we're going to try and study the body and the mind, maybe we have to figure out the relationship between our body and our behavior, the things we can observe, and our mind, the things that we can't observe. And so with this mind-body problem, the first perspective we always look at is mind-body dualism, sometimes just called dualism. And this is the idea that the mind and the body are two separate entities. They are dual things that exist separate from one another. And by this sort of understanding that they are two separate things, we're actually saying that you can't study the mind, because all we can observe are our behaviors. We can observe what the body is doing, but we can't observe the mind directly. And if our theory is that the body and the mind are separate, then we can't study the mind even if we study the body. And that's a problem for psychology because it means that we lose half of what we say we're going to study. And so one of our important names under dualism is René Descartes. And you might actually know him because he was a mathematician. The further back you go, the more they seem to dabble in multiple fields. But Descartes was a French philosopher and mathematician. He's the one you can blame for analytic geometry, that link between geometry and algebra. That's his fault. So he had this idea that the mind is inherently immaterial and therefore unknowable. So any attempt to study the mind is fruitless, and stop wasting your time. He had an interesting theory that the mind existed and connected to our body through what's called the pineal gland. So this teeny tiny little spot in our brains, right in the middle there, and that our mind interacted with our body through animal spirits. It's a very interesting theory if you ever have time to look at the Wikipedia page for it. But that's as much detail as I'll go into about him. On the other side of the fence, we have the monists, people who believed in monism. And these are the ones that led to psychology being what we can actually study. So this is the belief that the mind and the body are one. They're not separate and unconnected things. They are one and the same. So our mind is within the body and it's part of the body. So we're saying the mind is not separate, it's not a spiritual entity, it's the stuff that is happening inside our heads. So as our brain is working through things, as we're sensing and perceiving things, that's our mind. It's not something spiritual and other, it's just the process. And so our important figure here is Thomas Hobbes. And he said that mental events are a product of physical events. And as I said, that's really important for psychology, because until this school came up in contrast to dualism, they were saying that studying the mind was pointless and not something you could do. So until monism said, no, it's actually the same thing, you can absolutely learn about the mind by studying the body, psychology couldn't have arisen much, much later in time. All right, and I'm going to actually stop there. We'll get into British empiricism and then actual psychology in the next class. But yeah, I'll let you guys go just a little bit early, and I'll see you in here again on Wednesday.